Assalamu alaikum. Cell membrane. Every cell has a membrane, human or animal or any other organism's cell. We call it cell membrane or plasma membrane. The main functions of the cell membrane are forming a biological barrier that separates what's inside the cell from what is outside it, regulating the passage of the substances into and out of the cell. This is called selective permeability. That is, the membrane only allows certain molecules to pass through while obstructing the passage of other molecules. The cell membrane consists mainly of a phospholipid bilayer. As for the structure of the phospholipid, it consists of three parts: the head part, which is the negative phosphate group, the tail part, which is the fatty acids, and the skeleton part that connects them, which is glycerol. Since the phosphate group is charged, the head part is water-soluble or hydrophilic. And fatty acids, on the contrary, make the tail part insoluble in water or hydrophobic. But at the same time, they are soluble in lipids, and we call them lipophilic. Since the phospholipid has a hydrophobic part and a hydrophilic part, we call it amphipathic. The head of the phospholipid is polar and the tail is nonpolar. In the aqueous medium, the phospholipids are positioned as two layers, so the hydrophilic head is facing out and the hydrophobic tail is facing inward, and we have this familiar membrane shape that we see in every cell. Let's talk about the permeability of the membrane. The cell membrane is semi-permeable. That is, it allows the passage of some molecules and obstructs others. And this depends on size, polarity, and charge of the molecules. We divide molecules according to their permeability across the membrane into 5. Small, uncharged molecules, such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, can pass through the membrane freely. Small, polar molecules, such as water molecules, can pass through the membrane but at a slower speed. Large, uncharged molecules, such as vitamin A, can pass through the membrane but very slowly because the molecule is large. Large polar molecules cannot pass through the membrane. And finally, charged ions cannot pass through the membrane. Additionally, the membrane contains cholesterol, which takes a function in controlling fluidity. So, in normal conditions, if the membrane is exposed to low temperature, the membrane lipids will automatically come closer to each other. And if it is exposed to high temperature, lipids will move away from each other. Here, the cholesterol function is to push them apart in cold temperature by increasing fluidity, and attract them in high temperature by decreasing fluidity. Thus, it maintains the membrane's fluidity, resistance, and stability. The cell membrane also contains proteins, and they may be of many forms. Integral proteins that are permanently anchored or part of the membrane. Peripheral proteins which are temporarily attached to the membrane. And lipid-bound proteins which lie between the two phospholipid layers. Membrane proteins have many different functions. Some act as transport proteins for molecules that cannot pass across the membrane, so they pass through specific integral proteins under certain conditions. Some work in signal transduction. And there are a lot of other protein types in the membrane. We will discuss them in detail in biochemistry and biophysics. The membrane also contains carbohydrates, which are usually attached to proteins in the form of glycoproteins, or attached to lipids in the form of glycolipids. Both glycoproteins and glycolipids have important functions such as determining the cell's identity, which we will discuss later. The proteins, lipids, and cholesterol in the membrane are not fixed, but rather they are constantly moving and floating, and this gives us a form we call the fluid mosaic model. This was an overview of the cell membrane. Now let's review the main points. The cell membrane consists of a double phospholipid layer. The phospholipid has a polar head part that is hydrophilic and a nonpolar tail part that is hydrophobic, but it is lipophilic. The cell membrane is semi-permeable, allows the passage of uncharged molecules and small polar molecules. The membrane contains proteins. One of their functions is to serve as transport channels for the molecules that cannot pass through the membrane. Cholesterol's role in the membrane is to control fluidity in all temperatures, and the carbohydrates are found attached to proteins and lipids. This concludes our discussion about the subject. If you want to test your knowledge by solving the questions, continue the video. We said that in high temperatures, membrane components diverge from each other, so cholesterol decreases the fluidity to attract them, while at low temperatures, membrane components come closer, so cholesterol increases the fluidity to push them apart. We mentioned that large nonpolar molecules can pass through the membrane. Carbohydrates in the membrane are usually found either attached to a protein or attached to a lipid.